Good morning. My assignment is to provide a bit of an historical background to drug shortages, viewed from the perspective of an academic economist. Which is the agreement. Okay, fine. Thank you. I have 4 parts to my presentation. The first part will be just sort of defining and identifying drug shortages. Secondly, I'll want to distinguish classic drug shortages from disaster shortages. And then at the end, I'll spend a few minutes thinking about are the solutions and challenges for classic shortages different from or similar to those for disaster shortages. What is a shortage? If you talk to a pharmacist at a hospital, they'll tell you, well, we ran out of a drug, we can't get adequate replacement unless I deal with some unlicensed suppliers. I don't want to do that. An economic perspective from your Econ 101 textbook is that a shortage exists when at any given market price, the quantity demanded by purchasers exceeds the quantity supplied by manufacturers. What you typically learn in a basic econ course is the way shortages are resolved is as follows. If there's a shortage, the price goes up. That means the quantity demanded falls. With the price being higher, more suppliers are enticed to enter the market, and the combination of reduced demand and higher price eventually resolves the shortage. By that sort of notion, shortages should just be transitory phenomena. The problem is, we've observed, as the previous speakers have noticed, that we've had shortages that have been very, very persistent. So there needs to be some barrier to creating for these shortages to be more so persistent. As Dr. Throckmorton stated, there are 2 sort of metrics of drug shortages. Let's look at some historical numbers. What you'll find typically is that the FDA's definition of a shortage is a bit more stringent. It's medically necessary, and typically the FDA finds that some drugs which the ASHP feels are shortages, the FDA believes there are some adequate substitutes for it. So you generally see the situation that the FDA number of shortages is smaller than that for the ASPH. And significantly, as we'll see, the proportion of the FDA's shortages that are injectable, sterile injectables, is very, very high, about 75 to 80% in recent years. If we take a look at the longer history here, you'll see that the number of drug shortages based on the ASHP definition has fallen in the last couple of years. It hit a peak in 2011. I think the number I just saw a minute ago from Dr. Throckmorton was 250 in 2011. Here it's 267. And then it's averaged about 150 to 175 over the last few years. That was the number of new shortages. If you take a look at the number of active shortages, that means those that are not resolved, you'll see that that has quite a trend as well. It hit a peak in 2014 here in Q3. It fell since then. It was pretty flat between 2015 and 2017, and then with the hurricane coming in fall of 2017, it started increasing again. One of the interesting phenomena is that these shortages are very widespread. They're not just in one therapeutic area. If you look at the early part of this decade, you'll see that the largest number were in 2 therapeutic areas, CNS, followed by antibiotics. We'll take a look at that later on to see how it's changed over time. What are the reasons for the shortages? because manufacturers don't always provide information, often the reasons are unknown. And that happens for about half of them. This is as of 2011. And manufacturing problems about a quarter. If you update that to 2017, it's still about half of them are unknown, and manufacturing is still the largest second largest at 30%. I want to spend a minute on alternative dosage formulations. The usual doses that we take are oral capsules or tablets, and those are called non-parenteral. What are parenteral dosages? Those are dosages that are administered by a route that bypasses the digestive tract, such as a drug given by injection. Among the parenteral drugs are the so-called 5I drugs, medicines administered via inhalation, infusion, instilled, implanted, or injectable means. This is from a document published by IMS in 2011, where they noted initially that about 80% of the drugs that were in shortage were injectables, and more than 80% of them were generics, very old drugs. In fact, if you took a look at that point in time by when were these drugs initially launched, this is 2011, 58 out of the 160 or so were launched in the 1980s, which is 20 to 30 years old at that point in time. So the shortage drugs, excuse me, are disproportionately old, generic, injectable drugs. But that doesn't mean that there's, excuse me, that there isn't an issue with non-parenteral drugs. This is a graph that takes a look. It's on a left vertical axis is a number of unresolved shortages for parenteral drugs, and on the right vertical axis is it for the non-parenteral. What you can see is they're extremely highly correlated. The absolute numbers are quite different. There's typically more parenteral drugs that are in short supply than non-parenteral, but their trends are very, very similar. The correlation coefficient was 0.95. And if you look at the average age of the unresolved shortages, on the vertical axis it's for parenterals, and you see that goes from 0 to 40 months. On the right vertical axis, you see it for non-parenterals. It goes from 0 to 20 months. What that implies is that the parenteral drugs take much longer to resolve than do non-parenteral drugs shortages. And just as one other correlation here, you can see that the trends for the number of newly reported shortage drugs are very similar for parenteral and non-parenteral. So, what's new for classic drug shortages? We've had shortages in the past: flu vaccines, blood serum, plasma supplies, for example, heparin, manufacturing problems, but they typically subside in 12 to 24 months. The differences here, or in the last decade, have been there are many therapeutic categories, not just one or two. They're confined largely, but not completely, to the U.S. So that suggests there are some institutional issues in the U.S. That have some unique implications. They're persistent. They go back at least to a decade ago, and they're not decreasing in prevalence over time. They're mostly generic commodity old drugs manufactured by a small number of large multi-product firms, multi-product generic firms. They're mostly infused, injected, reimbursed by Medicare Part B, administered in community practices or hospitals. And an interesting mystery is we have a pretty good story to tell for parenteral drugs, but we don't have as good a story to tell in general for the non-parenteral drugs, although we do know that the non-parenteral drugs shortages are resolved more quickly. So what's different about injectables? Well, they're more difficult and costly to manufacture. You need aseptic clean rooms for fill and finish of the active pharmaceutical ingredient into sterile syringes or vials. You need very rigorous process controls, highly trained, recertified workforce. that's subject to numerous periodic FDA inspections. You also need to control the downstream distribution system. These are products that have some sensitivity occasionally to light and certainly to temperature. So what that implies is you've got higher manufacturing distribution costs. As a result, you have less generic entry for injectables that are off patent than you do for solid oral drugs. What's also different about injectables is, as I pointed out, is that fixed costs are extremely important. Injectable fill and finish is increasingly automated. It limits human interactions to highly trained labor, and so that generates economies of scale. But for injectables, there's also a lot of cost advantages to producing multiple products. If you're filling syringes, you can fill syringes with many different things. And so there's also what's called economies of scope. And while economies of scale and scope are present for oral drugs, they're much more pronounced for injectables and the 5 drugs. Just a couple quick slides here. Some generic firms supply many shorted products. This is from 2011 IMS document. You see Hospira with 63 products that were shorted. I think Hospira's still got issues with their Kansas manufacturing plant. That's been very, very prominent. But there are other multi-product firms, Teva, Bedford Labs, Fresenius Kabi, Sandoz, the subsidiary of Novartis, and others. One of the interesting things is that most of these shorted products have only a couple of suppliers. 2/3 have 3 or fewer suppliers, so that if one supplier has a manufacturing problem, that leaves a big hole in the national market for the few remaining suppliers, which exacerbates the problem. On the demand side, what I basically want to point out is that there's been change in demand. We have got growth in Medicare Part B population because of demographics. We had the recession and the Medicaid expansion. Together, these two, Medicare plus Medicaid, mean that the public sector is playing an increasingly important role. And a combination of reduced reimbursement by the Part B, growth of Medicaid, implies that drug manufacturers are facing a flatter government demand curve. Lower quantities demanded at high price and larger quantities demanded at a low price. There's also been a shift of care as there's been a lot of consolidation amongst physician offices that are now aligned with hospitals, and that's concentrated buying power. All this has put downward pressure on prices for manufacturers. In the terminology of economics, the demand curve has shifted out and to the right, meaning demand is more price elastic than it used to be. So what are some of the root causes that this suggests? It's likely something about the demand, supply, or pricing of these medically necessary drugs that doesn't allow the U.S. market to adjust or equilibrate quickly to these classic drug shortages. On the supply side, what's possibly behind it is the fact that manufacturers know that they've been consolidating. They have a lot of redundant capacity. This is not a good time to invest in new capacity. Indeed, there are pressures to downsize and close down plants. I believe Teva recently announced that it has 80 plants, manufacturing plants, and that the efficient number would be 12. And so we're going to be seeing a lot of downsizing of plant sizes, which is going to complicate trying to build a backup capacity. Let me shift very briefly to natural disasters. As was alluded to, we had a hurricane a little more than a year ago. We may have another one in the next few days, Hurricane Gordon. And that hurricane which hit Puerto Rico decimated a lot of the drug manufacturing infrastructure. Particularly result in shortages of small volume parenteral solution products like saline bags, which are very, very common in hospitals, used to start IV lines, administer blood, often used for diluting other liquids. And although the Section 503B of the of the amended 2003 Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act enabled certain firms to compound drugs, the 503 firms in Puerto Rico were not able to make these solutions because the majority of empty bags needed to do so were manufactured in Puerto Rico. And as a result, what you see here, earlier I showed you a slide, and I'll quit here very quickly, that showed the composition amongst shortages by therapeutic class, with CNS and antibiotics being the most common. Now you see, especially for 2017, the electrolytes are dominating in terms of therapeutic class. So let me conclude with the following. Classic shortages seem to have systemic underlying supply and demand issues requiring data-informed, evidence-based, non-transitory changes in reimbursement policies and investment and regulatory incentives. In contrast, shortages emanating from disasters raise issues of restoring manufacturing and distribution capacity and maintaining inventories of certain medically necessary products, akin to our having in this country a strategic petroleum reserve. As the UK now prepares for a possible March Brexit, we're reading in the newspapers both public and private sectors are making and beginning to implement plans to avoid drug shortages there. These Brexit shortages, I think, can be viewed as a bit of a hybrid between classic and disaster shortages. But regardless of what type of shortage it is, I think one of the most important themes we will come across today and tomorrow is that we need data. We need much better data to identify where the shortages are and where the possible manufacturers are. Thank you.